from that. And they said that Khnum essentially would hand make man and woman on his potter's wheel,
right.
and also create his ka,
okay.
which would be his spirit soul.
Right.
The ba is the heart soul. So that's the difference between the two.
Right.
And then from there, they said Ra would breathe the breath of life into his lungs, just like in the Bible it says God breathed the breath of life into Adam. They say that Amun was the one who breathed the breath of life into humanity after Khnum ordered the creation of his organs.
Right.
And over time, Khnum started to tire of that particular job.
Right.
So he consulted with the Neteru, and they all came to a decision that he would no longer perform that job.
Okay.
What he in turn did was he took the potter's wheel and broke it up into pieces.
Right.
He took a piece of the potter's wheel and implanted it in the womb of every female. So the power of life and creation, he then gave to the human female through the African woman.
Whoa.
So what made her so important is the fact that she is the place where the mystery of creation takes place. We start from single-cell organism, a sperm and an ovum, and through means that we don't necessarily completely understand, there's a divine order that the womb of the mother, in the womb of the mother, where the ordering of a human being takes place. No different than in the womb of Nut, the ordering of our solar system took place. So we worship the woman as heaven because it's within her womb or within heaven that the creation of the child takes place. And it's a mystery unto us. The biggest mystery, which made women so important, was before the advent of DNA testing, the only way that a man would know if a child belonged to him was if the mother told him so.
Right.
And the only way she could be assured of that is if she did not have any other sexual partners.
Right.
So that preserved the sanctity of the woman, and also it also created what we call the Immaculate Conception. That whole idea, Dr. Ben actually talked about that, means clean birth.
Right.
And clean birth is any birth in which the mother is 100% sure of who the father of the child is.
Right.
If she doesn't know because she had multiple partners, then that would make her a harlot.
Yes.
And ultimately, the child would not know who their father is. And that's not good for the preservation of the respect of the sanctity of the African woman.
You know, you just narrated this story here about a woman.
Yes.
And again, in my tradition, Bakawako, there is a declaration or whatever Europeans call commandment.
Okay.
That is, honor your father and your mother.
Yes.
And there's even a saying that you can disrespect your father, but you cannot disrespect your mother. If you disrespect your mother, the punishment is more severe than if you disrespect your father. So the story you just gave me explains why that is so. So in our tradition, it's very, very difficult for you to offend your mother in such a way that she say, if she does that, you are in trouble.
Okay.
So I thank you very much for bringing that up.
Yes.
Most people in this world use phrases, even quotations, without knowing the antecedents of the phrases or the quotations.
Yes.
Case in point, Christians preach the word of God, knowingly or unknowingly, that it has its antecedents from Africa. The ancient Kemetic script that you know is the word of God.
Absolutely.
From Jehuti.
Yes.
When I talk about divine speech, that's where I got you know, the power from to do this. Tell us about the Meduneta and try to instill on us why it is about time that we introduce this into our curriculum across the globe.
Absolutely.
Where Africans are.
Yes. It was Sheikh Anta Diop who spoke about the importance of Meduneta.
Okay.
One of the few that spoke about that. The history of Meduneta is that it was the lingua franca of the African continent.
Okay.
So if you study Kemetic history, you know that they have 42 nomes, which were 42 cities. Those cities actually were connected to different African tribes that made up Egyptian society. So Egyptian society was not a homogeneous society. Everyone was not from the same ethnic group. Egypt happened to be the most important area where the amalgamation of all of the symbiotic cultures of Africa came together in one place, and they created one nation out of that. No different than the United States has 50 separate states that all come together to make the United States of America. Egypt had 42 nomes that belonged to different ethnic groups in Africa, but those groups all came together under one umbrella that they called Kemet at one point. And the language that they spoke, Medu Neter, gave them the ability to understand each other across the linguistic barriers. So in other words, Sheikh Anta Diop saw the connections between Medu Neter and Wolof, Medu Neter in the Yoruba language, Medu Neter in the Igbo language, Medu Neter and the language spoken by the San, the Hutu, the Khoi, all of these places, because the original people, original humans that came from Central Southern Africa, they spread to the Sahara area before it became a desert. Then as the Sahara started to dry up around 12 to 10,000 BC, going to about 6,000 BC, those African groups that inhabited that area then migrated to they followed the rains, no different than the herds of buffalo or wildebeest in Africa follow the rain. Wherever the rain goes, the animals go, because they know that there's fresh grass to eat. So human beings started to follow the rain. And as they realized that the Sahara was drying up, the only place that was providing constant, consistent water was the Nile Valley. So they settled there, they followed the trail of the Nile, and as Egypt was subsequently invaded, those groups then spread to West Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. So when you say that all of the religions of Africa are basically the same, that is absolutely true. There's very few nuanced differences between the two. But if you actually speaking of the language, and you're speaking of the actual, the composition of the deities, the functions of the deities, the reverence paid to ancestors, the ultimate respect for the mother. Africa as a continent the vast majority is matrilineal. There's very few patrilineal tribes in Africa. And even in the patrilineal tribes, there is an honor and respect shown to the mother. So these were all things that were understood. A great book that outlines the unified origins of African people culturally is The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. He speaks of the fact that when Europeans came to Africa, especially South Africa, Shaka Zulu, and actually in the movie Shaka Zulu, they talk about that. When Shaka Zulu was fighting Zwide, their tactics were not violent. They were actually trying to scare each other. And you heard the British people say, these Africans don't know how to fight. They're not actually killing each other. Because for Europeans, war meant killing. For Africans, before the incursion of Arabs and Europeans, there was very few violent acts committed between different groups.
You intimidated each other.
They intimidated each other. So if I felt this is the boundary of our border, and I feel that you came across and incurred on our border, I would get a group of warriors together to scare you back across to your side of the line. And we wouldn't kill you. And matter of fact, he speaks of the fact that after these so-called wars, the two different groups would laugh and sit alongside each other and joke because they understood that they all had the same source. And it was with the coming of Europeans and Arabs that the idea of the destruction of human life came into play. And that unified understanding of who and what we were, basically Africa was a Pan-African continent ultimately before Arabs and Europeans came. They, I would say, de-Pan-Africanized it by colonization. I would say racism and white supremacy was the tool that they used to decolonize and de-Pan-Africanize Africa. And as they kidnapped us and planted us in different parts of the world, they also sought to ruin home so that we never had a home to go back to. And as a result now, we're trying to remember the broken pieces of ourself, which is what makes the story of Osiris so important. The idea of his body being cut up into 14 pieces and being remembered is actually the telling of the story of African people. We were broken up into many groups spread all over the planet by Europe incursion.
Yes, yes.
And now we're trying to come back together and remember ourselves, put the body of Asar back together so that we can now rise as one people once again.
Whoa.
Yes.
Brother Williams.
Yes, sir.
You know, the knowledge that you are impacting right now, you just didn't get it by yourself.
Not at all.
Somebody had to instill it
Absolutely.
in you. Dr. Ben just transitioned
Yes.
into
God
the
rest his soul.
ancestral realm. And we have to pay homage
Yes.
to him. As a student of Dr. Ben,
Yes.
tell us about this great man and how you stayed under his feet and what you think of yourself today.
Sure. I was introduced to Dr. Ben through my father. My father came to America in 1971. Him and my mother both came from Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay.
When he got here, he started going to college. This is before I was born. I was born in 1973.
Okay.
And he told me that when he went to college, he was told by his college professor that African people had no history of note and that African people contributed nothing to the development of human civilization or the advancement of human civilization. And he's told me that that was something he also heard in Trinidad before he came to America, that Africans had no history of note and that we didn't contribute anything to the advancement of human civilization. He told me that he always knew in his gut that those words were not true.
Right.
He never had the historical understanding and the verbiage to convey that message that that wasn't true. He just knew it in his heart. He just didn't have access to the knowledge to be able to combat that kind of assault on his African self.
Right.
And while he was in college, he came across Stokely Carmichael. We all know him as Kwame Ture, and another Trinidadian who came to America to help his American brothers and sisters fight racism and white supremacy.
Right.
And it was Stokely Carmichael who was the driving force behind his awakening. After he met Stokely Carmichael, he came in touch with the First World Alliance.
Okay.
First World Alliance was actually founded by Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, and a whole slew of other African historians. You had, in First World Alliance, we would go to different locations, the Schomburg Center, Reverend Hubert Dotri's church, and a few other places, and we would sit at their feet in sometimes small settings and other times larger settings. Sometimes we went to Brooklyn College. We went to different places around the city.
True.
And Dr. Ben, Dr. Clark, John Jackson, Chancellor Williams, Ivan Van Sertima, all of these people would come regularly and teach us about who we were. And the approach that they took was a very uncompromisingly African approach. So they did not bite their tongue. They were able to combat the fake and false European information that was given using direct facts that they discovered. So Dr. Ben went to Nubia, he went to Egypt. As an anthropologist and an archaeologist, he turned the spade over in the soil and he brought firsthand knowledge from the Nile Valley to us. One of the most important things he had ever said to me was when well, not to me personally, but he was giving a lecture.
Group, right.
He said that when he first started to travel to Egypt, he went with European scholars, European so-called Egyptologists, and he would have to stay in the desert in order to do his field studies, as far as sleeping close to temples and close to important spiritual structures in order to decipher the information and discover the new information that was being brought out. And he said that the white Egyptologists were so racist that at nighttime they would build fires in order to keep the wild animals away. Now back then, Egypt still had crocodiles, you had scorpions, you had cobras, some areas you had lions. So this was an area, these places were places that were in nature, so you had a chance of encountering wildlife.
Right.
So these white men would build fires to keep the wildlife away. And because Dr. Ben was the only African there, they wouldn't allow him to stay with them. So he would have to sleep in the dark, in the cold, in the desert, amongst the wild animals, away from them, because he said they didn't want to get their skin dirtied by being touched by an African.